There's Something in the Reeds by J.J. Lincoln. John pulled into the car park, driving his new Land Rover Defender. The vulgar xenon beams blinded Malcolm as the large vehicle pulled up next to his. Malcolm sat on the boot sill of his Range Rover and sipped piping hot coffee from an orange Yeti flask. John parked. Malcolm took one last swig from the cup lid and poured the rest out onto the gravel. He twisted the lid back onto the flask and slipped it into a Mystery Ranch rucksack. He had bought both at a conference in Tampa. The bag was huge but lightweight. It only held his lunch, a box of shotgun shells, and the rest of the space was taken up by realistic plastic duck decoys. Toby, an aging black Labrador, sat on the ground and was as eager as he was loyal.
"Is that the new car, then?"
Malcolm asked. He had heard the gravel crunching under John's boots and spoke without turning. A skittish Springer Spaniel ran up to Toby and sniffed his behind. Malcolm worried John would do the same.
"Sure is. Do you want to smell the tyres?"
John asked.
"You what?"
Malcolm replied.
"Come on now. That's the best part of buying a new car. What do they put in the tyres and the interior that smells so bloody good when they come out of the factory?"
John asked. John put on a brown cap that covered his receding blonde hair. His face gave an alcoholic red glow that could warn distant ships of rocky shores.
"It's formaldehyde and acetaldehyde escaping the plastics,"
Malcolm replied.
"Oh, that doesn't sound good. Still, can't beat that smell,"
John said. As if to reiterate his point, he took a long sniff of the salty coastal air.
"Hey, it can't be worse than what is being kicked out of that thing."
Malcolm looked north to the Hartlepool nuclear power station and shrugged. The building was the only thing visible thanks to the powerful security lights. It sat in a sea of black, beyond the tangle of marshes and ponds of the delta.
"What are you working with today?"
Malcolm asked.
"Beretta A400 with LA VIP 3-inch shells. You?"
John replied.
"Benelli Super Black Eagle with Fiocchi wetland shells."
Malcolm replied. The two men took their shotguns out of their slips and handed them to the other. To the untrained eye, the camouflaged shotguns looked the same. Malcolm had tried John's gun on a previous hunt and admired the low recoil, even with magnum shells. He preferred his gun because the Beretta could jam with smaller loads. The Benelli was a little more consistent, a trait Malcolm admired in men as well as weapons.
"Fiocchi wetland. Bit of a light load, isn't it?"
John asked.
"Well, you know my shoulder has been giving me problems, and I must admit, I had a few whiskies last night. I don't fancy being knocked around by 3-inch shells all morning."
Malcolm replied.
"Fair enough."
John said.
"The 86 Lagavulin?"
"No, it wasn't a special occasion. I was reading and wasn't paying attention to the bottle of Talisker I was draining."
Malcolm put his shotgun back in its olive-green slip and slammed the boot lid. He heard John tutting as he used his key to lock the boot. The two men whistled for their dogs, then set off towards the marshes. John was a little shorter than Malcolm, but in the right shoes it would be hard to notice.
"I don't understand why you still drive that old thing,"
John said.
"Old, it's a Kingsley."
Malcolm replied.
"What's a Kingsley?"
John asked. Malcolm hated talking about wealth, but it was all John wanted to talk about sometimes. If Malcolm had other friends who shot more than driven pheasants, he would leave John at home. Malcolm felt sorry for John. He was 45 years old and put his entire life into his career. Retired at 40, he had 2 ex-wives and a kid with each who hated him. If John disappeared off the face of the earth, it would take a while for someone to notice.
They take a classic Range Rover, dismantle it and rebuild it into a modern car. From the outside it looks vintage, from the inside it is brand new."
Malcolm replied.
"What's the point?"
John asked.
"To me it looks like an old car."
"That's the point. It gives me the satisfaction of owning something special. It doesn't make my neighbors in Ravendale jealous. They think it's just an old Land Rover.
Malcolm replied.
I have seen your house. Why not buy something flash? You ever thought about one of those Lamborghini SUVs?
John asked.
Jesus, you wouldn't buy one, so surely.
Malcolm replied. They arrived at a bench and the end of the path. The two men helped each other put on waders that went to their chests. Malcolm helped John put on his backpack. They needed to cross a few smaller ponds before getting to a small lake, where there would be plenty of sleeping ducks in the reeds. The two men took their shotguns out of the slips and stuffed the slips into a pocket on John's backpack. The sky was a shade lighter than the ground. Both were bleak. The fetid stench of brackish water filled their lungs.
I like people knowing how hard I have worked in my life. If that makes me a bad person, so be it,
John said. Malcolm knew John was working class too. While Malcolm tried to hide his past, John wasn't ashamed of his roots. He wondered if his philosophy of stealth wealth was working. Over the years, he had lost touch with his childhood friends. He gravitated towards the wealthiest people in Ravendale and became his new self. They crossed the second pond and stopped talking. They switched off their head torches and used the last of the moonlight to see. Malcolm pressed a button on the side of his gun, and a shell was loaded into the barrel. It was so quiet, he wanted to check the shell was properly seated, but it was still too dark to see. He didn't want to risk putting on his head torch and revealing their location. There was a small strip of land between the second pond and the small lake. The hunters crept over the mound of knee-high grass, and their dogs instinctively copied them. Toby sniffed at the air as they approached the pond, a good sign if Malcolm had ever seen one. As they approached the south side of the pond, John moved away from Malcolm, and they entered the reeds. Malcolm had watched the lake for 2 mornings, 2 weeks apart. Mallards slept on the east side of the lake and flew west inland at sunrise. Malcolm waited, and his breathing slowed, his heart rate lowered. He savoured the moment. A cool breeze was on his face, and he was in total silence. He looked east to a hairline strip of amber rising over the horizon. He flicked his gun off safety. 15 minutes later, a mallard swam out of the reeds to his right and waggled its tail and shook itself awake. Malcolm brought his shotgun to his shoulder. John blew a duck call. Flapping wings struck reeds, and a moment later they were up in the air. Malcolm fired 8 shots. He reloaded, instructed Toby to retrieve the carcasses. John used his duck caller again. They waited. Malcolm pulled his duck caller out and gave 2 short bleats. A large group flew over from a pond to the north. With the birds coming right at them, it was difficult to miss. Toby dived out into the pond and returned the birds. The hunters waited for an hour and blew into the duck callers every 5 minutes. Eventually the ducks stopped coming. When Malcolm left the reeds and climbed up the grassy mound, it was light enough to check his watch. "Oh, 9:30, he said to himself.
How did you do?
John asked. Malcolm dropped a ripstop bag onto the grass and bent down. He flung out 12 birds, and Toby went crazy, sniffing them and wagging his tail in delight.
12,
he replied.
You?
8. I think Toby might have snatched a few of mine,
John said with a grin.
Keep telling yourself that.
John laughed.
You were right about this place. It was a bit of a faff to get to, but if the rest of the day is this fruitful, it will have been worth it.
Malcolm put the ducks back into the camouflage bag and attached it to the outside of his rucksack. He looked down at his shotgun and realized a reed had caught in the loading mechanism. He pulled it out, removed the shells, then checked the gun was clear. He reinserted the shells and made sure the safety was still on.
Where's next?
John asked.
We walk around this pond to one northwest of here.
Malcolm replied.
Great, let's get going.
John said. The two men walked on the grass as long as they could, then down into the reeds of the large pond. They stayed close to the edge and kept their shotguns ready in case any ducks flew overhead. Something flew overhead, but Malcolm couldn't tell if it was a duck or seagull, so he left it. It wasn't worth shooting a seagull and getting into trouble. They came around the lake and followed a stream. The stream bed was made of fine silt, and the men sunk further down as they walked. They travelled 10 or so meters before they climbed out of the stream bed and walked along a narrow edge of ground. On their left were marshes, on the right more marshes. Malcolm looked back to check John was still following, then carried on towards the next lake. By the time they arrived, the sun was up, but thick cloud made everything grey. Malcolm could see his breath swirl in the October air and brought his jacket collar up to cover his mouth. He didn't want any ducks to see the white plumes rising above his head. The jacket muffled his breath a little, and satisfied, he carried on along the thin strip of land. They approached the lake and Toby cocked his head. His tail was under his body, and he looked up to Malcolm with black eyes. Malcolm didn't notice. He was too busy scanning the horizon. They waded into the reeds. Toby clung to Malcolm's legs and he shoved the dog away.
"What's wrong with you today?"
Malcolm asked. Toby whined. Malcolm patted his dog. Toby licked his palm and pushed his head into Malcolm's leg. John caught up with Malcolm. He walked around to the left and looked out the reeds into the centre of the pond.
"Is this the spot?"
John asked.
"Yes. Help me get the decoys out."
John unclipped the top of Malcolm's rucksack and removed the flecked duck decoys. Malcolm threw them into the pond outside the reeds, and he pulled out his phone. He opened an app, and a moment later, the ducks started to move to the center of the pond. The duck snagged on something a couple meters out from the reeds, and Malcolm put his phone back in his pocket.
"We're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way,"
Malcolm said. John finished eating a cereal bar and shoved the wrapper into his waders.
"Come on then,"
John replied. They waded out into the pond. They checked each step before they moved forward. If the water came over their waders, they could drown, and nobody would find them out there. Malcolm reached a duck on the outskirts of the group. It wasn't snagged on anything, but was linked via Bluetooth to stay with the other ducks. He threw it further out into the water. He reached another duck. This one was free, and threw it further out. When he pulled the third duck out the water, it was curiously heavy. He looked down at a black mass below the duck and wondered what it could be.
"John, come help me with this."
"Hang on,"
John said as he waded out to Malcolm. The two men reached down under the duck and pulled. The water became muddied and detritus floated to the surface. They pulled harder, and the thing loosened. A bloated white face bobbed on the surface, and the two men thrashes about in the water, trying to get away from the body.
"Christ!"
John screamed. A flock of ducks flew out of the reeds on the opposite side of the lake. They made it back to the reeds and looked back at the body floating in the lake.
"We need to call the police,"
John said.
"Wait."
Malcolm replied. He looked out at a black plastic package floating next to the body. It was attached to orange inflatable bladders.
"What is that?"
he asked. John raised a small pair of binoculars and looked at the package.
"Do you think it's drugs?"
he said.
"Calm down, this is Middlesbrough, not Medellin."
Malcolm replied. John lowered his binoculars, then quickly raised them again. His hands were shaking.
"Well, what is it?"
he asked. Malcolm pulled his phone out. He opened the decoy app and moved the ducks towards the package. He used the ducks to push the package to the reeds, and John grabbed it.
"It's damn heavy,"
he said. They grabbed a side of the package each and brought it out of the reeds and onto the raised verge. Malcolm dropped his rucksack and got a small knife out of one of the pockets. He slipped it into the package and prized off a layer of black plastic and tape. It was tightly packaged with multiple layers of plastic. The knife slipped and he nicked his left thumb. Blood trickled down his wrist and he handed John the knife. John kneeled and started slashing at the package. Malcolm wiped the blood from the wound and looked at the wound. It was small, so he grabbed a handful of napkins out of his rucksack and held it against the wound. He picked up his shotgun of the wet ground and looked over John's shoulder. He had opened the package and was staring into the contents. It was gold.
"How much do you think this weighed?"
John asked without looking around.
Even with the two of us, it was heavy. 50 kilos, could be a little less, I suppose.
Any idea how much it's worth?
John asked.
A lot. A hell of a lot.
He raised his shotgun and fired, hitting John in the back of the neck. He fell forward and rolled off the gold. Malcolm turned the shotgun to the Springer Spaniel, and the blast kicked it up into the air, and it landed in the reeds. Malcolm couldn't see if it was still alive. He walked over to John and watched for any movement. He was dead. There was a lot of blood on the grass, and more was pouring out of John. Malcolm grabbed his waders and dragged him into the reeds. Nobody would find the body out here. Nobody found the guy in the lake. Malcolm smiled, then looked out the reeds to where the body was floating in the lake. It had sunk back down. John was head to toe in camouflage, so Malcolm thought it would be best to keep him in the reeds. Malcolm aimed at John's mouth and blew out all his teeth. He crouched down and picked up the shell floating in the water by his feet. He slipped it into his breast pocket. Malcolm went back to the gold. The bag was extremely heavy, and he could barely stand upright. He dropped it back down. He looked back at the lake and wondered if he could be identified if someone found the decoys. They had been linked to his phone. Perhaps someone could track him. He sighed and grabbed the bag of ducks. There were some nice mallards in the bag, and he tutted as he grabbed every plump bird and threw it into the reeds. He replaced the live birds with the decoys and slung the bag over his shoulder. He looked down at John's blood-splattered shotgun. He thought about taking it with him and putting it back into the safe. He remembered the safe needed a code to open. He would never figure it out. He picked up the shotgun and launched it into the reeds. The splash startled Malcolm, and he looked around to see if anyone else could have heard it. He attached the bag of fake ducks to his rucksack and struggled to put it on. He clipped the waist belt and chest strap and cinked them tight.
"Come on, Toby,"
he said. The dog looked back at the lake and panted. He sat down and wagged his tail for a second. Malcolm brushed his hazelnut hair back with a shaking hand and noticed a speck of blood as he brought it down. He wiped it on his waders.
"John's not coming, let's go,"
he said. Toby whined, then came to Malcolm's leg. They walked down the thin strip of land back to the first lake. He lowered himself down the slope and entered the reeds. Toby kept his head low as they traced their path back the way they came. Malcolm heard the distorted rumble of a far-off lorry. It sounded like a plane at first, until he looked up and saw nothing. When the rumble subsided, he heard a rustle in the reeds behind. Malcolm froze and slowly crouched. He listened. Toby pushed his head against Malcolm's shoulder and looked exactly where Malcolm heard the noise. There was nothing, not even a bird. It must have been a ripple in the water pushing the reeds. Malcolm reached the smaller ponds, although it didn't look like how he remembered. He thought it was a circle, but this was kidney-shaped and dog-legged to the right. He stood up, as tall as possible, and looked around. He couldn't see any landmarks, only reeds and beige grass. He looked back where he thought the ocean was. Again, he could only see beige. His eyes darted around in his head as panic set in. If he got lost, if he had to call for a rescue, he would be caught. At dinner parties, Malcolm had often said prisons are too luxurious. He would say prisoners are treated like guests at a 5-star hotel. The prospect of being charged for murder made him second-guess his opinion. He remembered the nuclear power station was north of the marshes. He looked around for the hulking grey containment building. It wasn't there. Panic truly set in, and he rushed forward through the reeds. Malcolm splashed and almost stood on Toby as he went forward. The wise Labrador kept his distance from his master. Malcolm came out of the reeds and almost fell into the water. It was instantly deep, far deeper than it should have been. Malcolm grabbed a fistful of reeds and spun himself back from the edge. He tried to catch his breath. He looked around for Toby.
"Toby!"
he shouted. The dog bounded forward and wagged its tail. Malcolm patted his dog and walked back from the deep, dark water. He reached down and rubbed Toby's stomach. Toby smiled with his tongue out and wagged his whole body.
"I'm a bit lost, Toby lad. Any chance you can lead me back to the car?"
Malcolm asked. Toby cocked his head and his brow furrowed for a moment before returning to his big, dumb Labrador smile.
Thought so,
Malcolm said. They kept on walking until they reached a grassy inline. Toby sprinted up and Malcolm followed. At the top, Toby was staring back into the reeds with his tail between his legs. He had stopped smiling and was licking his chops frantically. Malcolm looked back down the incline and saw nothing. He stood tall on the mound and looked around. He could see the dark grey containment building and found north. He looked left to where he parked his car. He could see his Tuscan blue Range Rover on the other side of one last pond. Malcolm looked down at the pond and the ring of reeds. It was shallow enough to wade straight across. Something was stopping him from lowering himself down the slope. He looked back from where he came. He couldn't shake the feeling someone had seen him kill John. It was highly unlikely, but there could be another wildfowler in the marsh. Malcolm slid down the meter-high hill, and for the first time in years felt his right knee burning. It was tendinitis. Malcolm pushed on through the reeds. He could afford the best physiotherapists and stem cell surgery known to man. He smiled from ear to ear and hobbled through the brackish water. He looked back, then rushed across the pond. When he was on the other side, he crouched down into the reeds and loaded a shell into his gun. He shouldered his shotgun and aimed it across the pond. There was no movement. The reeds on the opposite bank swayed lazily in the breeze. Malcolm lowered his gun. He could smell new tires. It seemed strange as he was, still 50 meters from John's new car, but he could smell the brand new rubber smell. Malcolm suddenly realized the brand new Defender would be a dead giveaway that John was missing. He caught his breath and carried the gold back to the cars. John's car was the largest model, a 130, with 8 Napier leather seats. There was no way he was pushing it. Malcolm had a multi-tool in his boot. He could cut the handbrake cable. He would need to figure out where the handbrake cable was. If he managed to cut the cable, he could use his car to push John's into the pond. It would be above water but not visible from the road. With winter coming, there would be no bird watchers until it warmed up. Nobody walked their dogs in the marshes. It was easy to get lost, as Malcolm knew too well. If he liquidated his assets, plus the £5 or so million in gold, he could live a long and happy life off the grid in some hot country with hotter women. Malcolm placed the rucksack full of gold into his boot. He opened the top and looked at the gold, as if convinced it would not be there. The lustrous colour of wealth told him otherwise. He closed the top of the rucksack and felt the sensation somebody was watching him once more. He looked down at his loaded shotgun on the boot sill of his car, and he slowly reached down to grab it. Malcolm spun around and saw two people staring at him. Their bloated faces were horribly corrupt, with their jaws misaligned and black marbled veins pulsed on their foreheads. Their wretched hands were outstretched, with gnarled fingers spasming. Their mouths fumbled over silent words too terrible to speak. What was left of John's mouth made a sickening flapping noise. This was not a thing a living man could bear, and Malcolm swung his shotgun up into the air. He fired 4 shots into the apparitions before him, then fell to the ground. Toby was long gone. Malcolm couldn't remember the last time he had seen his dog. Some faithful companion he turned out to be. Toby turned and fled when he realized what was pursuing them. John grabbed one of Malcolm's legs. The floating man grabbed the other. Malcolm swatted at them with his unloaded shotgun, but they smiled in return, then went back to frantically speaking without words. The gravel tore into Malcolm's back as they pulled him across the car park. The two things looked in pain as they walked. Their joints clicked, and their movements were choppy and random. Malcolm bit through his tongue. He didn't know when. They dragged him down a grass verge and into the reeds. Malcolm thrashed to keep his head out of the water. His waders were full, and not all of it was water. They dragged him to the edge of the reeds, and Malcolm could see the middle of the pond ahead. John looked back at him, and he smiled once more. They pushed him under. Malcom stared up at the dead faces watching him drown. Water got into his mouth. It had a strange, industrial, metallic taste. Metal. All he could taste was metal until everything went black. Words filled his mind, terrible, evil words that repeated over and over. He felt his lips move and repeat the otherworldly mantra. He didn't know how it was possible. He was dead, yet he was saying the words. Radix malorum est cupiditas.